adaptational effects that fuel adaptation to environmental change remains an important challenge for evolutionary biology. The peppered moth is an example that solidifies Darwin's theory of evolution. But how did this one species of moth change evolutionary research forever? Well, let's take a look. In a paper first published in 1896, a man named J.W. Tutt observed a difference in the appearance of the British peppered moths. The first phenotype is the typica, pictured on the right. It is kind of hard to see, but if you look closely, you can see that there is a moth, kind of light and speckled with darker spots that blends in almost perfectly with the lichen that commonly grows on the tree trunks in their common habitat in England. Around the 1760s, the typica phenotype of the British peppered moth began decreasing in commonality. Also around the 1760s, the Industrial Revolution in England began and picked up steam. This Industrial Revolution led to the pollution of air and the dying off of lichen in the habitat of the British peppered moth. The second phenotype of the British peppered moth is the Carbonaria phenotype, pictured on the left in this image above. It blends in extremely well with darker barks, which meant that once the Industrial Revolution of England began, the trees, which had been covered in soot, and the lichen, which had been killed off and thus vanished, made a perfect habitat for these moths to blend in. Because of this, this phenotype began increasing in commonality.
While the appearance of the dark-colored moth was first identified in the 1880s, until the 1950s that the topic was first researched, Bernard Kettlewell and Michael Majoris contributed to our knowledge of natural selection through the peppered moth's evolution. In 1953, Kettlewell was the first to scientifically investigate the appearance of dark-colored moths. He believed that birds selectively prey on peppered moths depending on their body color in relation to the environment. In his first experiment near Birmingham, he collected moths to determine how many had survived. The results showed that black moths had the best survival advantage. 2 years later, he replicated the experiment in polluted woods near Birmingham and in clean woods near Dorset. He believed that if natural selection was at work, then moths would be lighter color in clean woods. He was right. St. Majoris revisited Kettlewell's research in order to overcome perceived flaws in the research. Over 7 years, he recorded the outcomes of moths he had released into an unpolluted plot of woods. He was found the daily survival rate of dark-colored moths was significantly lower than that of light-colored moths. Building upon earlier studies, research led by Van Toff and Satchery added a further layer of insight into the mechanism of adaptation in response to natural selection. The team set out to map the Carbonaria within a larger population sample in order to more narrowly define a specific region where the mutation occurred.
To begin their research, they collected both phenotypes of the British moth, the typica, light-colored, Carbonaria, dark-colored, and they sequenced their DNA and compared them. They were then able to find a transposon that had inserted genetic material. Now, what does a transposon do?
Transposons are mobile genetic elements which can be found in almost all organisms. They are often referred to as jumping genes because they can move seemingly at random around a genome, jumping from one location to the next in the DNA.
The comparison of the Carbonaria, the dark-colored moth, and the typica, the light-colored moth cortex gene, shows a specific area, signified in yellow, that is where the transposon inserted DNA. This is where the activation occurred and increased the activity of the cortex gene that caused the melanism, or darkening color, of the moth. The research that was done showed that the most expression of the cortex gene happened during the crawler stage, a time between larval and pupa. The researchers were also able to infer when this mutation actually occurred, and they inferred that it happened in 1819 during the early Industrial Revolution. It is signified by the dotted line right after the 1800s, and this graph shows the probability density, or the likelihood, that it occurred at that time, and that is where the peak is located. Biritsh Peppered Moth Melanism, or Darwin's moth, follows the four facets of Darwin's theory of evolution. With the genetic mutation only being 200 years old, a lot has happened. It's gone from a single mutation to practically a new subspecies, and to that subspecies becoming nearly extinct, all due to the environmental impacts of humans.